I think that especially given the moral complexity of it and given how many different ways it happens and how often it happens, that our discourse surrounding violence is grossly insufficient. Part of the problem is that we have one word to describe so many things. So the same word that we would use to describe a mountain lion killing a deer for food is the same word that we would use for Germans invading Russia, violence and violence. And it's the same word that we would use for British and Americans bombing Dresden. And it's the same word that we would use for a man sexually assaulting a woman. And it's the same word that we would use for the woman pulling out a gun and shooting the man who is about to sexually assault her. We use the same word for all of those. And so it leads to, I think, great moral confusion and also to a lot of absurdities. And that's not even to include the same word is also used to, at this point, describe somebody disagreeing with somebody else. Or it's also used to describe somebody breaking a window. And side note, that I would actually say that that breaking a window would not be violence in general, because the window is not a being who is not a being unless you're a full-on animist, in which case you are doing violence to the window because the window is a being. But I think that breaking a window could be violence, because a really easy example would be, let's say a woman is separating from her abusive boyfriend, and then he comes and throws a rock through her window to intimidate her. That would be, I would believe, an act of violence because of the intent to intimidate. But that's just all a side note. The real point is it leads to all sorts of absurdities. Like, I remember years ago, there was a dogmatic pacifist who said to me that she has never in her life, and she would never commit any act of violence. I remember saying to her, how do you eat? How do you defecate? Every time you defecate, you kill a whole bunch of bacteria that were perfectly happy in your guts. You expel them into the outer world where they no longer live. So you're doing an act. And she said, that's just absurd. And that part of the problem is that we're using this same word, but she was unconsciously choosing to call some forms of violence. She was using a definition of violence which she had not bothered to define. She didn't define violence because I think we didn't pursue it further, but I would think she would say that if you punch somebody in the face, that's violence. And I think she would also say that if you kick a dog, that's violence. But it's like, so it's not just humans in her case, but then where is it? I don't know, but I'm guessing that she would not think that squishing a spider is violence. I think from the spider's perspective, it is. But in any case, so I spent years trying to figure out a definition of violence I was happy with. And here's one I'm reasonably happy with, which is violence is any act that does material harm to another. And we could make subsets. We could make a subset of emotional violence where I were to gaslight you, that would be not physical violence because I'm not doing material harm, but I'm doing emotional harm. So we could carve out subsets. But in any case, I really like the definition of violence, doing material harm to another, because it makes clear the ubiquity of violence, that every time I take a step outside, I might accidentally smush little insects or nematodes. And from their perspective, that is certainly an act of violence. And so where I get really interested and where what I would really like to see is a discussion of those forms of violence that we do personally and socially find acceptable or not acceptable. And here's a pretty easy example that I think most of us, under most circumstances, most of us humans, under most circumstances, would find it morally acceptable to do an act of violence to a carrot. I mean, you're killing the carrot when you eat it, and that's doing material harm. So I think, but it's not absurd. It's like, oh gosh, Derek, that's silly to define that as violence. Again, I'm using a very broad definition to try to get at something, which is, first, most of us under most circumstances would find it morally acceptable to do an act of violence to a carrot. Most of us under most circumstances would find it not morally acceptable to do an act of violence to a human being. There would be some circumstances in which we might find it morally acceptable to do an act of violence to a human being. Let's say somebody was trying to kill me or trying to kill someone I love, then I think most of us, most of the time, would find it morally acceptable to stop that person using whatever means are necessary. And so my point is, it's absurd to say violence is bad. Just like it's equally absurd, I've seen some revolutionaries say, or some pseudo-revolutionaries, or whatever you want to call them, say, oh, any escalation is good. Any escalation toward violence is good because the system is so rotten. Like, no, the system is rotten does not mean that it's okay to go to your next door neighbor's house and hit the 92-year-old woman on the head with a shovel. But there are essentially no circumstances in which I would find that a morally acceptable escalation of tactics. I don't care who or what she is. Well, unless she's holding a gun on your little niece and is about to shoot your niece, in which case, the point is that we as society need to have discussions of what forms of violence we do and don't find personally and socially acceptable. For example, clearly, we as a society find it morally acceptable to kill the fish in the oceans. We as a society find it morally acceptable to wipe out insect populations, migratory songbird populations, shorebird populations. We can say that's a bad thing, but if you look by our actions, and of course actions speak louder than words, clearly as a collective, we find that morally acceptable. And I think there are, and I think I've laid out stuff here, and what I really want to do with this video and with really much or all of my work is to start honest and thorough discussions of where and why we draw lines as to what is and is not acceptable violence, both personally and socially. And I think that that happens through an informed discourse, and that discourse is completely lacking in this society.